Okay, I'll give you a chance to read that slide before I go on. Well, anyway, it's great to be here with you in Arlington once again. The last time I was here, we spoke about dinosaurs. Still one of my favorite subjects, but tonight, quite a different subject. It has to do with Darwinism. So I call it Science and Humanism, the Consequences of Bad Ideas. Now, I could have subtitled it The Bitter Fruits of Evolutionism, because that's really what it's about. The influence of evolution in our society. And as I was researching this, I was surprised at how many different facets of our lives have been influenced by the idea of evolution. Well, before I get started, this is actually kind of a heavy topic, so I thought, well, let's start off on a little bit lighter of a note. A few minutes ago, Heinz mentioned visiting the full-scale replica of Noah's Ark in Kentucky. It was built by Ken Ham and answers in Genesis. Of course, the atheists are all up in arms about it. They're accusing him of spreading lies and mythology and all this kind of thing. But I was thinking about Noah and his ark. What kind of lights do you suppose Noah used on the ark? Well, floodlights, of course. Well, we've been dealing with a lot of issues at our house lately, and so we've been spending a lot of time taking care of our grandkids. And so we decided we had to child-proof the house, but it didn't work. They got in somehow anyway. Well, it seems like the older I get, the faster time flies. I guess that means I'm having fun, but anyway, it seems like before we know it, it's going to be Christmas time again. Well, do you know what Christmas is? Well, Christmas is the time that evolutionists celebrate the day that Jesus evolved. Okay, well, science and humanism, the consequences of bad ideas. For the longest time, evolutionists have charged that creationism is going to hinder science. It's going to propel us back to the Dark Ages. Is this really true? Or is it the other way around? Of course, the media likes to portray the issue as science versus faith. In other words, the image that they're trying to portray is cold, hard, objective facts by scientists working diligently in the laboratory versus religion. Oh, well, that's just faith. That's just fluff, just subjective feelings, you know. But is that really true, or is it our science versus their science, our faith versus their faith? And I think we're going to find out that it's really a faith issue, that they have to have faith to believe what they believe. The idea that I'm trying to present tonight is that evolution actually produces bad fruit. Ideas have consequences, and when those ideas are acted upon, the results can be catastrophic. As one author put it, evolution not only implies but demands atheism. And that's what we're going to see tonight. To start off with, though, I'm going to talk a little bit about religious beliefs and the nature of science. In other words, we in the Western world have enjoyed the fruits of centuries of advancement of science and technology because I believe it has a rigorous basis. But what does it take to establish and sustain that science? So the requirements for sustaining science go like this. First of all, we have to view time as linear, beginning with some point, that is, creation. Some beliefs view time as cyclic, going around in circles. In other words, eventually we're going to come around to the same place again, so that tends to hinder investigation. If we're just going to come around to the same place, why bother studying anything? This is common in reincarnation, for instance, and transmigration of souls, common in Eastern. Another requirement for sustaining science is that explanations for natural phenomena cannot start with pseudo-scientific assumptions such as mythical accounts of creation. So whatever you believe, you build on a starting point, whatever that assumption is, you go from there. If the starting point is faulty, then the results are going to be faulty. Another requirement is we can't believe in pantheism. That is to say, everything is God. The material world is God, you're God, I'm God, and it tends to hinder scientific investigation when we believe that, because then man isn't distinct from the creation. This is common in New Age environmentalism, for instance, Hinduism. But we need to see God as separate from His creation. We also need to believe that creation is predictable and orderly and purposeful. If not, if it's just random, the physical laws may change, then why bother investigating it? Why spend a lot of time on it? Because we can never know the future with any certainty. Another requirement is that astronomy can only develop if the heavens aren't thought of as living or divine. If they're just manifestations of the gods, for instance, as the Greeks believed, then it's hard to study because the gods are seen as capricious, malevolent, and you never know what they're going to do next, and so the heavens are one way today, maybe another tomorrow, and so this tends to hinder astronomy. Next, there has to be a balance between reason and faith. Now, if we just say that, when we don't understanding, if we just say that, oh, well, God did it, that's not really an adequate explanation, because most of the time God works through His natural laws. Now, sometimes, of course, He overrides these laws, especially at the time of creation, but He's given us the ability to investigate the things that He's created. On the other hand, we can't have just reason alone completely eliminating the Creator, because we can only go so far with that, as evolutionists do. And finally, we have to be seen, that is, man has to be viewed as unique. A unique creation separate from the creation, made in God's image, and given dominion over the earth to subdue it, as it says in Genesis 1:28, not trash it, but have stewardship over it. So with that in mind, let's look at some of the reasons why science has not flourished in other cultures. The Greeks, the Chinese, the Hindus, and various other cultures had a form of science, but it fizzled out. Why? Because it didn't have a rigorous basis. For instance, Hinduism believes that the external world and its orderliness is not there. It's not real. It's denied. So if it's not real, if it's not orderly, then why try to study it? It sort of reminds me of the movie The Matrix. You know, nothing is real. And they believe in eternal cycles. Things just go round and round, so it's hard to study. They believe in a form of pantheism and the divinity of the heavens. Likewise, or at least similarly, with Islam. Islam views Allah's power as being above His reason. You can never know His will from day to day, and so why bother to study His creation? humans really have no freedom of choice anyway. It reminds me of the story of a guy who is at a river. He's taking water out of the river downstream where somebody had just urinated. And he was asked, why are you doing that? And the guy replies, well, whatever's Allah's will is Allah's will. We can't change it anyway, so why bother? Well, with that kind of attitude, science is not going to advance very far. Islam uncritically accepted the Aristotelian worldview, which said that the earth is the center of the system, which is shown in the illustration there, and they didn't progress beyond that point. And so it makes it hard to really understand the heavens. Evolutionary humanism really is a type of religion with their own faith. They, I feel, can't go past a certain point in science because they start with a number of unprovable assumptions. One example is Uniformitarianism. Uniformitarianism says that all geologic processes are going on over eons and eons without any real change, going on at the same rate almost forever. In other words, they say the present is the key to the past. Whatever's happening today is what's always happened. Well, Uniformitarianism is an unprovable assumption. They weren't there, they can't prove it, and of course they deny a Genesis flood, which had a lot of effect on the earth. They also put faith in unobservable, untestable, and unrepeatable past processes. The scientific method says that in order to prove a hypothesis, it has to be observable, it has to be testable, it has to be repeatable in the lab or someplace else. Evolution fits none of these because it's past processes, processes which cannot be repeated, processes which can't be tested in the lab. Likewise, they believe in materialism and naturalism only. There's no room for a creator. Materialism says that if we can't sense it with our five senses, we can't detect it or measure it in the lab, it's not real. It doesn't exist. Naturalism says that only natural processes, natural laws are acceptable. Nothing else is real outside of that. There's no room for any creator. And they see man as just the result of random chance processes and not particularly distinct from the rest of nature, except we've evolved a little bit farther. On the other hand, Christianity believes in a creator who created an orderly world capable of being discovered. And if it's capable of being discovered, it's orderly, it's predictable, then we can make predictions based on theories or discoveries. It's interesting that Puritans have often been criticized as being prudish, stuffy, strict, hypocritical, self-righteous, and all this sort of thing. But actually, it was Puritans, in many cases, who led the way to scientific discovery. They were prominent members of Britain's Royal Society, their premier scientific organization, and like I say, in many cases, they paved the way for what we know today. So the advancement in science in Western civilization, I say, has been largely due to the Christian worldview. And contrary to many who believe that the Dark Ages were that, just dark and nothing happened, there were actually a lot of scientific and technological advances during the so-called Dark Ages. I haven't got time to go into it all, but things did happen during that time. In fact, I would say it's evolution that has stifled free inquiry. Just ask somebody who's lost a job when they dared mention that they believed in something like intelligent design. One guy was fired for publishing a peer-reviewed scientific article in a journal that mentioned something about intelligent design or God or something like that. Eventually he sued and got his job back, but they stuck him in a basement someplace. But that just shows that academia these days is not really open to free inquiry. Finally, questions that often baffle evolutionists can easily be answered by creationists. An example would be the Ice Age. Evolutionists really don't know what causes ice ages. They think there are many of them. They propose the so-called Milankovitch cycle, which deals with eccentricities in the Earth's orbit, but that doesn't really explain how ice ages can occur. There's not enough variation there in temperature. But they ignore the Genesis flood, which apparently was a direct cause of the Ice Age. So let's look at the fallout on modern culture. What are the results of evolution in our society? Well, our beliefs have consequences, as I mentioned before. The famous Russian author Dostoevsky says if there's no God, then everything is permissible. Well, I think we're seeing that in our society today. They're treating our society as if there is no God. We can do whatever we want, and so the laws are always changing, and you can see the fallout in some of the Supreme Court decisions and other places. So what I'm going to do is apply Darwinian theory to social Darwinism. So what does that mean? Okay, so Darwinism, the modern theory of Darwinism is that evolution takes place by natural selection working on mutations. Well, that's been extended to social Darwinism, which means the application of Darwinian theory of natural selection on societal institutions, on society itself. So let's see what is the overarching theme. Natural selection has been equated with the struggle for existence. In Darwin's book, The Origin of Species, he talks about the struggle for existence in a number of places. Well, this has been carried forth to races. Now, this isn't very popular today, but in the past, it was commonly believed that races are biologically unequal and locked in a struggle for life and death. In fact, Darwin was the one who coined the term race. And as we'll see in a little bit, he was actually a racist. Evolution then progresses not through moral principles, according to them, but by the right of the stronger. This has far-reaching implications. That means might makes right. It's the law of the jungle. Therefore, since evolution is true, we can exercise our dominion over whoever's weaker. Is basically what it comes down to. So here's some areas that we're going to look at tonight. If you're taking notes, you don't need to bother to write all this down because I'm going to touch on each one as we go. Let's take a look, first of all, at the church. You would think the church wouldn't be affected, but let's take a look. There's been a lot of compromise in the church today, resulting in the abandonment of Scripture as the final authority. Why? Because a lot of people don't know how to reconcile evolution with the Bible. So they think, well, we can just combine the two. It becomes known as theistic evolution. Well, if theistic evolution is true, then Genesis, as well as other books, are not true. Well, wait a minute. Jesus quoted more from Genesis than any of the other books. So if Jesus believed in a literal six-day creation, well, maybe he was wrong. Well, if he was wrong, then maybe he wasn't the Son of God manifested in the flesh. Maybe he wasn't, in other words, he wasn't right, so what about the rest of the Bible? Maybe that isn't right either. And so if the Bible isn't reliable, the focus shifts. It becomes on social justice rather than our relationship with God, our fallen nature. And so then other foundational doctrines tend to be left aside, such as creation, the fall, the virgin birth, the flood, and so forth. And so we gradually lose our founding beliefs. So the result then becomes a subtle form of moral relativism in the church. Why? Because, well, you know, you can believe the Bible. I guess that's right for you, but I don't think it's true, so it's not right for me. What's right for you is wrong for me, and so forth. That's moral relativism. And here I have a quote from Charles Darwin himself. He says, "A man who has no assured and ever-present belief in the existence of a personal God or of a future existence with retribution and reward can have for his rule of life, as far as I can see, only to follow those impulses and instincts which are strongest or which seem to him the best ones." He realized, as he came out with his theory, the moral implications that were to follow. And he lost more than a few nights' sleep about this. And his fears have come to pass. The result is, as they used to say, the new morality, which is really no morality at all, has taken reign in our society. How long before it results in political chaos? So in cartoon form, absolutes versus relative morality. Either we came from Adam, and God sets the absolute right versus wrong, or we descended from an ape-like creature, and therefore we set our own rules, which change almost from day to day, it seems. Michael Denton, in his book, Evolution, A Theory in Crisis, says it was because Darwinian theory broke man's link with God and set him adrift in a cosmos without purpose or end that its impact was so fundamental. He's recently come out with a new book called Evolution, Still a Theory in Crisis. Evolution has produced a devaluation of life, really a culture of death. I think of that every time I look around and I see some kid with a black t-shirt with a skull and crossbones or some death symbol on it. Where does that come from? How does that affect abortion, euthanasia, eugenics? If you're not familiar with those terms, I'll explain them in a little bit. But it goes back to the late 19th century. There was a professor in Germany by the name of Ernst Haeckel who came out with a theory called embryonic recapitulation. Haeckel was an admirer of Darwin. He enthusiastically promoted Darwin's theory. Haeckel's theory was also called the gill slit theory. And in it, he claimed that the human embryo had gill slits, which were a leftover from earlier stages of evolution. He came out with a number of drawings like this one here. If you notice along the top row, the early stages of the embryo all look kind of alike, all along here. The human embryo proceeding to the baby on the right. But his theory was that all embryos start off similarly, and therefore we're all related. There was only one problem. He faked his drawings. These drawings were deliberately made to look like the first stages were all alike. Well, it turns out that, well, in the first place, he was repudiated by his fellow professors at the time for having faked the drawings, and yet people grabbed onto these. They were published in textbooks for well on to 100 years, and still you occasionally see them today, even though subsequent research has shown that it's totally false. But he came up with the saying that this was a fundamental law of biology, that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. What he meant by that was all the lower stages of evolution were reenacted as the fetus developed into a baby. And so, in other words, all of the stages of evolution were represented during the development. And so this led to an excuse for abortion. The message of Haeckel's embryos persists with us today because they say, well, the fetus isn't really human yet. It's just in the lower stages of evolution. It's just an animal. We can get rid of it, no problem. This was advocated by Margaret Sanger. Margaret Sanger was the founder of Planned Parenthood. You've probably noticed that Planned Parenthood has been in the news lately for selling baby parts illegally, and yet, according to what I've heard, they're still getting funding from Congress. But anyway, apparently their philosophy hasn't changed since the days of Margaret Sanger, because she said that birth control was nothing more or less than the facilitation of weeding out the unfit. Catch that word, unfit. It comes from Darwin's statement, or whoever said it, survival of the fittest. That's the sort of the catchphrase of evolution. And so she was trying to weed out those that were not fit. Well, who's she to decide who's fit and who isn't? Euthanasia is also directly related to Darwinism. It also hinges on survival of the fittest and the idea of euthanasia. Euthanasia, by the way, literally means easy death. In Oregon, they build it, of course, as death with dignity. But there's an underlying motive to that, promoted by guys like Dr. Death himself, Jack Kevorkian, whom I understand is still doing 10 to 25 years in prison in Michigan for infanticide, unless he's gotten out by now, I'm not sure. But anyway, the view there is that Haeckel's law has given them, well, not only Haeckel's law, but what I meant to say was they are weeding out the unfit there by bettering society, by getting rid of those who aren't producing anything. So it makes society better. Well, of course, it's already led to abuses in Europe. People have been done away with without their permission. How long will it be till that happens here? It seems like a good thing when these things are dreamed up, but a lot of times it ends in disaster. Well, eugenics literally means well-born. And according to their own literature, eugenics is the self-direction of human evolution by means of selective breeding. In other words, they want to have the motive of helping evolution along. In fact, Darwin had the subtitle of his book, the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. In other words, as I mentioned earlier, Darwin was a racist. He viewed some races as more evolved than others, and of course, the ones that he thought were the best were the Western Europeans. The ones on the bottom were viewed as the Tasmanian Aborigines, which were equated to Neanderthals at one time. Evolution views death as a good and necessary process. Again, quoting from Darwin. Thus, from the war of nature, from famine and death, the most exalted object which we're capable of conceiving, namely the production of the higher animals, directly follows. So, is eugenics helping the evolutionary process? Well, Francis Galton thought so. Francis Galton was a cousin of Darwin and an enthusiastic supporter and admirer. He applied Darwin's theory to the betterment of the human races, so he thought. So what he said was he wanted to give the more suitable races or strains of blood a better chance of prevailing speedily over the less suitable. Well, who's less suitable? Well, according to him, of course, it was the Western Europeans. Margaret Sanger warned of the dangers inherent of the very idea of humanitarianism and altruism, dangers which have today produced their full harvest of human waste. This was in the 1920s and 30s. She branded the feeble-minded a menace to the race and compared them to weeds. Well, it's ironic that today there's an award called the Margaret Sanger Humanitarian Award, which was presented to Hillary Clinton and I think Nancy Pelosi or some other politician. But somehow they have forgotten Margaret Sanger's own words saying that humanitarianism is evil. Helping the downtrodden is bad because it hinders evolution. And so she thought that death should hasten evolution. Well, of course, today, eugenics has taken on a sour note. Darwinists distanced themselves from it after the Holocaust of World War II. But they say that, oh, well, that distorted Darwinism. Of course, they still believe in it. But anyway, how about racism? How has Darwinism affected racism? Well, as I mentioned earlier, that especially at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, human races were put on kind of an evolutionary ladder. And so there's the story of Ota Benga. Ota Benga was a Congolese pygmy who was captured, brought to America, and put on display in the Bronx Zoo. He was put on in a cage next to an orangutan, trying to show that he was an evolutionary missing link, just one step above the orangutan. They even filed down his teeth, as you can see from this photo, to make him look more primitive. Well, finally, after a couple of years, some clergymen protested loud enough that they finally took him out of the cage, but he was never able to adjust to Western society and ended up committing suicide. Another dark chapter in the history of evolutionary thought has to do with human zoos. These were popular end of the 19th. For example, in the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair, they had what they called a parade of evolutionary progress. And they put on display as many as 2,000 what they called primitives in what was supposed to be their natural habitat, showing them off as evolutionary missing links. Well, after the fair was over, they even put some of these guys, they were pygmies from New Guinea and Africa, they put them also in the Bronx Zoo. H.G. Wells was a eugenicist, by the way. H.G. Wells, you may recall, he was a popular science fiction author who wrote things like The War of the Worlds. He said, there's only one sane and logical thing to be done with a really inferior race, and that is to exterminate it. Unfortunately, that was the policy of the British government towards the Tasmanian Aborigines. They had a policy of getting rid of them just because they thought they were inferior. Now, they had started killing them off before Darwin came out with The Origin of Species in 1859, but once the book came out, that gave them an excuse to proceed, and they stepped it up. They were regarded as wild beasts, the Aborigines, and so the British thought, well, we're just following the natural laws of evolution. We're helping the human race by bettering it, by getting rid of the undesirables, the lowest ladder, or the lowest rung on the evolutionary ladder. Well, as a matter of fact, by the time 1876 came around, they were all gone. And it turns out that the Aborigine culture was probably a victim of de-evolution or degeneration. That is, they had lost a number of skills, such as the art of making clothing or fishing. They had been living on crabs and shellfish. They lost the art of making fire, so they had to keep a fire going all the time and borrow it from their neighbors or something like that. Well, the last ones died off, I think, about 1876. But it's interesting that evolutionists ran around digging up their graves, putting their bones on display in various museums, showing that these are Neanderthals just one step up from apes, and they're missing links of evolution. Well, there's another interesting aspect to this, and that's animal rights and evolution. Charles Darwin actually referred to something like this when he said, there's no fundamental difference between man and the higher mammals in their mental faculties. The difference in mind between man and the higher animals, great as it is, certainly is one of degree and not of kind. In other words, what he's saying is, well, we're the same as the animals, we're just a little bit more evolved. And so modern animal rights advocates have jumped on this bandwagon. And so if we're not created in the image of God, we have therefore no special status, but we're just a little bit higher on the evolutionary ladder than animals. And therefore, animals, not being that different from us, should have many of the same legal rights, legal protections as humans. So, animal rights advocates say that they should have things like legal personhood. They should be regarded by the law as the same as a person. They should have lawsuits filed on their behalf when somebody thinks they've been wronged. They should have compensatory damages for medical expenses. And guess what? A comfortable retirement. Now, of course, they apply this mostly to the ones that they think are closest to us, like chimps and orangutans and so forth. But theoretically, it could go all the way down to an ant, I suppose. Well, anyway, they also say that they should have constitutional rights, especially the ones like the 8th Amendment, prohibiting cruel and unusual punishment, and the 13th Amendment, prohibiting slavery. Animal rights advocate Stephen M. Wise is an ardent believer in scientism and believes that science has proven evolution and that the universe was not designed at all, much less designed for humans. Well, to jump to another facet of our talk today, the outlook on life. If the universe is without design, without purpose, then we're just accidents in space. We're just stardust that happen to fall together in an interesting pattern. And therefore, we're not unique. We're just the same as the rest of creation, and so why should we have any special rights? Well, with this outlook, it produces hopelessness, depression, in some cases, suicide. If we came from nowhere, we're going nowhere. So, what's the use of even living? Why not just party it up all the time? Live the good life. Eat, drink, and be merry, just like the Epicureans. So then life doesn't have any real meaning. And drugs, to some people, offer some alternative form of entertainment, maybe even a substitute religion. Maybe it gives them some hope, some reason for living. Harking back to the days of Timothy Leary, turn on, tune in, and drop out. If you remember that one. Well, social Darwinism has produced some other interesting results. It's what I call "it's not my fault" syndrome. If evolution is true, we're just helpless products of our genes, and therefore we're not really responsible for our actions. Homosexuality, for instance. Well, I was born that way. I just got the genes for it. Well, they've been looking for the homosexual gene, haven't found it yet. But they also look at certain animals and say, well, it's been observed in some of these animals. We're just highly evolved animals, so what's the big deal if we do it? Alcohol. And to back up just a moment, in 1981, the Kinsey Institute issued a report claiming that homosexuality was inherited, and therefore they had no control over their behavior. Well, anyway, alcohol can sometimes be viewed the same way. You notice that a lot of people refer to it as a disease that people have no control over. Oh, they say it's just bad genes. We can't help it. It's no longer looked at as a choice. There's even a school of thought relating to crime these days. They say that criminals aren't responsible for their actions because it's nature's fault due to bad genes. A whole school of thought says that criminals are genetically retarded, not that they've yielded to temptation or anything like that, but throwbacks to earlier stages of evolution. So this one guy says, violence then is natural. It's natural to man, a product of evolution. In other words, it's not our fault. We can't help it. It's just our inheritance. Well, how about in the political arena? Did you know that the 20th century was the bloodiest century in human history? Some 200 to 300 million people were killed under fascism, Nazism, and communism. And these can be related directly to Darwinism. For instance, even the title of Hitler's book, Mein Kampf, means my struggle, taken from the struggle for existence as portrayed by Darwin. In other words, he felt that he was actually doing a service to the human race by helping evolution along by getting rid of those that were less fit. In fascism, they felt that violence was necessarily for social transformation. In other words, might makes right. It's the law of the jungle, directly relating to Darwinism. And likewise with communism. In Das Kapital, Karl Marx wanted to dedicate it to Darwin because he was inspired by Darwinian theory. He took the struggle for existence and applied it to the so-called class struggle. Well, even in business, did you know that business has been affected by Darwinian thought, especially during the 19th century? They felt that business was just natural selection being played out in the business world. The struggle for business, the struggle for profit, for success. John D. Rockefeller, the founder of Standard Oil, said the use of ruthless business tactics is not an evil tendency in business. It's just merely the working out of a law of nature and a law of God. In other words, trampling your competitors, exploiting labor, and even cheating on occasion. No big deal. We're just acting out a law of God. We're doing God's will, amassing great fortunes in the meantime, by the way. It's even affected environmentalism. If God isn't the creator, then we're the product of evolution, and we come directly from the same materials that Earth did, so we should owe our allegiance to Mother Earth instead of Father God. The worship of the environment then can become sort of a substitute religion, sort of like a form of pantheism, which is a hallmark of the New Age movement, by the way. And there's even a thing called the nature's rights movement, which seeks to grant the same rights to flora and fauna that humans have had. There's a thing called the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Mother Nature, which announces that the rights of nature are inalienable, without distinction of any kind, such as may be made between organic and inorganic beings, origin use to human beings, or any other state. In other words, everything in nature has the same rights as we do. I guess a tree or a rock or anything, no different from us, according to them. Which leads directly to the Gaia hypothesis. The Gaia hypothesis says that the Earth is a living entity, a living system, and therefore it should be revered. And this spills over into the debate about climate change. Now, climate change is probably real, but of course it's been politicized. They view the Earth atmosphere system as fragile since it's evolved over millennia, or millions of years actually, and therefore we have to pass laws to protect it, to restore it. Well, how has evolution affected scientific research? A good example, SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. SETI has been scanning the skies for an intelligible radio transmission for 50 years now. Their equipment is capable of scanning 28 million frequencies per second. Over 50 years they've been searching, and to date they have found exactly nothing. Yet they continue because there must be life out there someplace. NASA, of course, has as one of its primary goals that we find where we came from. They say that their purpose is to explore the universe and search for life. Where did we come from? Are we alone? And so the latest deal with NASA has been exoplanets. Exoplanets are planets that are outside of our own solar system. And as of July 2016, there are 2,933 confirmed exoplanets, nearly 300 of which are considered to be in the so-called habitable zone. In other words, a zone around their host star, which is neither too hot nor too cold, so that it could support liquid water. In fact, I just saw an article in last night's paper where they have discovered one around Proxima Centauri, which they call Proxima B, I think they're calling it, and they say that, oh boy, there could be life there. Maybe it's Earth-like. Of course, you can't directly see the planet, so they don't know, but Stephen Hawking is saying, oh, we got to send a spaceship there. Never mind that it's 4 light years away, and of course it'll take who knows how long to get there, but anyway. So I show a picture here of one that was announced in 2015. They call Kepler 452b, which is apparently the most Earth-like planet they've discovered to date. Well, there are a lot of factors that determine whether it could support life. I won't take the time to get into that, except to talk about the Drake equation for just a moment. In 1961, there's a man who, I think he founded SETI. Anyway, his name is Frank Drake. He came up with the famous Drake equation. The Drake equation attempts to estimate what's the probability of finding an advanced civilization within our own galaxy. Being that there are 400 billion stars in our galaxy, they say, well, there must be at least 10 million civilizations of extraterrestrials out there someplace. Let's see, oh, SETI, it said 10 million. He said 100 million. Oh, well, what's a few million? Anyway, the thing is, later on, in a book called The Privileged Planet, Gonzalez and Richards have revised the original Drake equation and added a bunch of factors that Drake didn't originally consider. By adding those additional factors, all of a sudden the chances of finding a civilization out there become 1 in 700 quintillion. That's a little bit different. So in other words, it speaks of the uniqueness of life here on Earth. So is there extraterrestrial life? Well, it's a fascinating subject. Maybe sometime I can do a talk on just that, but for right now, let me give you some biblical reasons why not. First of all, in the Bible, the Earth is viewed as the center of God's creation. Now, not necessarily the center of the universe, certainly not the center of the solar system, but at least primary in God's mind. But not only that, what if there were extraterrestrials out there someplace? Well, presumably, they would be a fallen race also. They would need a Savior. But wait a minute, the Bible says that Jesus is the one and only begotten Son of God, and that Christ died once and for all. So, where's their Savior? Think about that one. Okay, well, let's look at some other examples of wasted research money using evolutionary assumptions. First of all, the Dynamo Theory of Magnetism. They think the Earth is 4.6 billion years old. But there's a problem there. if the Earth is that old, how could it still have a magnetic field, since measurements have shown that it's actually decreasing? So they've come up with the Dynamo Theory, and they've done all kinds of experiments in the lab trying to show how it could work. Well, guess what? They haven't been able to come up with an explanation. Maybe the Earth isn't really that old. Many of you are probably familiar with the Miller-Urey Experiments, which attempted to produce life in a test tube back in the 1950s. All they succeeded in doing was producing a jumble of amino acids. Since that time, those experiments have been replicated and expanded upon many, many times, all with the same result. No way to go from non-life to life. And here's a good one, searching for beneficial mutations. Many, many experiments have been done on fruit flies because they have a short lifespan. Thousands of generations have been irradiated to try to speed up evolution, but all they've come up with is mutated fruit flies. They haven't changed them into mice or horses or even beetles. But here is a picture of a mutated fruit fly with curly wings. That's all they've come up with. Excuse me. Well, as I wrap up, false ideas perpetuated by evolutionary thinking. One example, back problems. It was thought that since we evolved from creatures that used to walk on all fours, the S-curve in our spinal column was an evolutionary leftover, a poor solution to man's deciding to stand erect. So they prescribed treatments that attempted to straighten out the spinal column when people had back problems. But guess what? They didn't work half the time. It was only when they decided to restore the natural S-curve of the back that more success was achieved, because God made us that way. And you're probably familiar with the so-called vestigial organs. At one time they thought there were 180 different vestigial organs, that is, left over from evolutionary development. But guess what? All 180 have been accounted for by now. The tonsils and the appendix, of course, were ones that they didn't know about for a long time what their purpose was. The treatment for tonsillitis used to be, if the tonsils were infected, you yank them out. So when I was a kid, I was 6 years old, I had tonsillitis, they yanked them out. And during my childhood up through my 20s, I used to have really horrible colds. I'd be in bed for 2 weeks, sometimes even 3 weeks I'd be out of school. And so I sometimes wonder, if they hadn't taken my tonsils out, would I have had such bad colds? I don't know. Okay, well, they're telling me I've got to wrap it up, so I'm just going to say that junk DNA was claimed to be evolutionary leftovers, but it's not. They've shown that it has a purpose, and at one time they were claiming the common ancestry with chimps for humans because of similarities in DNA, but guess what? It's not so similar after all. It turns out that we're only about, what's the number? 67 to 79%, which means 125 million rungs on the DNA ladder are different. Okay, well, I'm going to just give one example of consensus science that was wrong, and that is in sanitation. There was a Dr. Ignaz Semmelweis, an Austrian physician, who noticed a high rate of death in the maternity ward, both of the mothers and the infants in his hospital. So he thought, well, maybe there's a problem with the physicians and sanitation. So he had his physicians wash their hands after examining dead bodies and treating other diseases. And guess what? The death rate in the maternity ward plummeted after they actually washed their hands. Well, the physicians on his staff didn't believe it. They said, that can't be right. What's the big deal? They deliberately disobeyed his orders, and the death rate went up again. It wasn't until Joseph Lister came along and sterilized everything that finally operations that were considered dangerous could now be done safely and routinely. Well, I'm going to go on. The last one I'll hit is climate change. Consensus science says that man is responsible for global warming, but guess what? 18,000 credentialed scientists have said that no, CO2 and man are not responsible for climate change. Well, this sums up the results of evolutionary humanism, a veritable Pandora's box of evils that has been released on the world. I want to finish up with the contributions of some Christian scientists. Heinz, could you pass out those handouts at this time? Is Heinz out there somewhere? Okay. I have a list of contributions to Western society and indeed the world of some of the different creation scientists, the ones who believe in a young earth. I don't have time to discuss them in any detail. Here's a representative sample. The handouts will show you even more. Here are some more of them. But needless to say, we would not enjoy the life that we do in the United States of America today if it wasn't for the contributions of these scientists. The technology today builds on the discoveries of all of these guys. I want to take just a moment to mention a couple of prominent ones. For instance, Isaac Newton, probably the greatest scientist of all time, responsible for discovering the laws of gravity, the laws of motion, calculus, first reflecting telescope. He held a number of prominent positions in society, but what most people don't know is that he wrote more books and papers on the Bible than he did in science, and yet those have all but been forgotten. He said that all of his discoveries have been made in answer to prayer. I want to mention one modern scientist, Dr. Raymond Damadian, the inventor of magnetic resonance imaging. He built the first MRI in 1977, received all kinds of different honors and awards, and yet was denied the Nobel Prize in Physics because he's a young earth creationist. And yet, a couple guys who did some refinements on the MRI were the ones who got the Nobel Prize. Finally, I want to end up by honoring Dr. Henry Morris, who in 1961 wrote the book with Dr. John Whitcomb, The Genesis Flood, which started the modern creation movement. He is considered the father of modern creationism, without whom we probably would not be here tonight. So I owe him a debt of gratitude. Dr. Robert Laughlin of Stanford says the Darwinian theory has become an all-purpose obstacle to thought rather than an enabler of scientific advance. So in conclusion, far from propelling science back to the Dark Ages, I say that creationist-based science has actually contributed much more than evolutionary ideas. And in fact, it's creation science that's hindered humanistic, materialistic ideas much to their dismay. That's what the real issue is right there. So let me finish with a scripture, Matthew 7:17 and 18. Even so, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a bad tree bear good fruit. And you shall know the truth. The truth shall make you free. Free from Darwin and his pestilential theory. So with that then, I will turn it over to Heinz.
Thank you, Bruce. And as he said, there's so much more to cover. There's so much bad science out there. He mentioned, of course, evolution a lot, but the other topic is climate change. Yes, climate is changing, but is man responsible? And we have somebody that's going to answer that question speaking here in November, and that's Dr. Larry Vardaman, who was vice president of ICR, that organization that Henry Morris headed up. And we as creation scientists agree that climate is changing, but it's not a problem. It has changed forever. We can't even predict the weather, let alone climate 100 years from now. So we're going to have him speak here in November. If you have a few questions yet, or Bruce will take some time to do that. But in the meantime, we're also going to take a free will, what we call a free will offering, in support of this ministry. That's how we can bring in these speakers. And I'll talk a little bit more about Shahram Hadian, who we're bringing in for next month, because he's a great speaker, as you've heard there, and he has a lot to share about Islam. So if you have a question.
You had a little slide showing Islam and how they had the earth as the center of the universe. Do they still believe that?
Hello? Yeah, okay. Yes. Islam has actually benefited from modern society because we're pretty much a one world now as far as communications and technology, and many Islamic scientists have studied in the United States. They've pretty well dispensed with that now. That was actually a leftover from Aristotle. They had at one time uncritically accepted the Aristotelian view and held on to it for a long time, but I don't think they believe that much anymore.
Other questions you may have? There's a lot of Bruce has some books available too that's going to answer some of these questions on evolution.
You mentioned there at the end talking about Darwinian pestilence theory. I've read a lot. I breed and show exhibition chickens, and I follow a guy who talks a lot about Darwinian teachings. And if I'm not mistaken, he worked closely with Mendel, with the pea pods, and so I guess my question is, when we're talking to the unbelievers out there, if we present all that Darwin had as pestilence and nothing good out of it, how true is that? I mean, was there anything that he taught that was truth and credible?
Well, I have a hard time thinking of anything positive that he did. He did a lot of experimental breeding of animals, a lot of research there, but I think he drew incorrect conclusions from that. He extrapolated the change that he could see in breeding to a degree of continuous change, whereas we see that yes, a certain amount of change is possible, but only within certain limits. And so evolutionists loosely define evolution as change over time. Yes, there is change, but only within certain boundaries. A fly cannot become a horse. You can breed different varieties of chickens, you can breed all kinds of varieties of horses, but they're still horses. So I think if we emphasize the fact that, yeah, there is change possible and adaptation, there's a lot of variation built into the DNA by God in the different species of animals, the different types, kinds of animals, really, but only within certain prescribed limits.
Another question here.
I just wondered about your opinion about some of the internet rumors about gene splicing on animals and kind of going off into the deep end there.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And I was just reading an article the other day about trying some of this stuff on human DNA. In other words, another form of selective breeding, another form of what they call positive eugenics. How far are they going to go with this human engineering in order to build a superior race? Oh, wait a minute, we've heard that before somewhere. So who knows what is going to come of that.
They still have to start with a living gene, though.
That's right.
I was just going to make a comment on everything that you were saying, particularly about Sanger. When man does not have God and does not want God and refuses God and hates God, man thinks he's God. Okay, hence Margaret Sanger. And when you see the ramifications of what has happened since Darwin, what it's affected our society and all of our lives, in our education system, everything else, everything. There is no good that's come from Darwinism, only evil. And when you look at somebody like a Margaret Sanger, you look at the impact of something so filled with hate that she thought she was God. She decided who was going to live, who wasn't going to live, and many, many others, Hitler, everybody else along the way. And today, when you think we have somebody that's running for president who looks to somebody like Margaret Sanger and tells Planned Parenthood that I have your back. That was one of her first major things that she said, I have your back. This election is so crucial. It's more crucial than anything we've ever had in our lives. I don't care if you're 110 years old. It's more crucial than any election we've had in our lives. This is why I truly want everybody that's a Christian really, really pray and really, really consider how important this is. Just the Supreme Court alone, if nothing else, just the Supreme Court alone, because once they have complete control. But I just, please pray, make a decision.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, if there are no further questions, I'm going to close this up, and you can always ask Bruce. He'll be available in the back there. You can ask him questions there, and you'll take advantage of the book tables out there. Well, so Bruce, thank you.